She delivered babies in every town from Texas to Montana until she delivered one that looked exactly like her. She had delivered 347 babies across the dusty frontier, but when she caught this one in her hands, her blood ran cold. The child's face was an exact mirror of the daughter she'd lost 20 years ago. What she discovered next would shatter everything she thought she knew about love, betrayal, and the cruel hand of fate in the Wild West. The wagon wheels turned slow against the dirt, making the same sound they had made for 20 years. Clara Hayes sat on the wooden seat, her black bag beside her, watching the horizon swallow the last bits of daylight. The horse knew the way better than she did now. Every road looked the same after 2 decades of traveling them. She had delivered 347 babies. She kept count in a small leather book that lived in her bag, next to the clean cloths and the bottle of whiskey she used to wash her hands. 347 first breaths. 347 cries that cut through the silence of birth. Each one a small miracle she had helped bring into this hard world. The towns blurred together now. Abilene, Guichita, Tombstone, El Paso. Places where women called her name in the dark hours when pain came with the promise of new life. She would arrive with her bag and her steady hands, stay until the baby breathed, and then move on. Always moving on. Tonight, the call had come from a cabin outside Dodge City. A young woman, barely 20, with no husband and no family. Just fear and pain and the certainty that something was coming whether she was ready or not. Clara had seen it all before. The story was always the same, even when the faces changed. The cabin sat alone against the prairie grass, a thin line of smoke rising from its chimney. Clara tied her horse to the post and lifted her bag. Through the single window, she could see candlelight dancing on the walls. She knocked twice, the way she always did, and waited. The door opened to show a girl with brown hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. Her dress was simple, made from feed sackcloth, and her hand shook as she held the doorframe. Her belly pushed against the fabric, round and heavy with promise. "You the midwife?" the girl asked, her voice thin as paper. Clara nodded. "I'm Clara Hayes." "What's your name, child?" "Mary. Mary Sullivan." The girl stepped back to let Clara inside. I think it's time." The cabin was small and clean. A bed in one corner, a table by the window, a stove that gave off more smoke than... Clara had seen 1,000 rooms like this. Places where hope and fear lived side by side, where women waited for their bodies to do what bodies had always done. Clara set her bag on the table and opened it. Clean cloth, scissors, a bottle of laudanum if the pain got too bad. Her hands moved without thinking, arranging things the way she always did. Order in the middle of chaos. Purpose in the middle of mystery. "How long have the pains been coming?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Since morning, but they're getting closer now." Mary sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the wooden frame. "I am scared." Clara looked at her then, really looked. The girl was young, maybe 19, with eyes that had seen too much too soon. There was something familiar about her face, something that made Clara's chest tighten in a way she didn't understand. "Fear is natural," Clara said, washing her hands in the basin by the bed. "Your body knows what to do. I'm just here to help." The next few hours passed the way they always did. Pain came in waves, building and breaking like water against stone. Mary walked when she could, lay down when she couldn't. Clara stayed close, watching and waiting, her hands ready for the moment when they would be needed. She had learned long ago not to talk too much during these times. Women in labor needed quiet, needed space for their bodies to work. But as the night wore on, Mary began to speak in the spaces between pain. "The father," she said during one quiet moment. "He was a good man. He promised to come back." Clara nodded, keeping her face still. She had heard this story too many times to count. Men who promised and disappeared. Women left to face the consequences alone. "He said he loved me." Mary continued, her voice distant. "Said he'd marry me when he got back from driving cattle to Kansas. That was 8 months ago." "What was his name?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure why. "Thomas." Thomas Hayes. The name hit Clara like cold water. Her hands stopped moving for just a moment before she forced them to continue their work. Hayes was not an uncommon name. It could be anyone. It had to be anyone. But as the night deepened and Mary's labor grew stronger, Clara found herself watching the girl's face more carefully. The shape of her nose, the way her eyes crinkled when pain came, the small scar on her chin that Clara could barely see in the candlelight. When the baby finally came, sliding into Clara's waiting hand with a cry that filled the small cabin, Clara knew. One look at the child's face, and 20 years of running crashed down around her like a house made of sand. The baby had Thomas's eyes, Thomas's nose, Thomas's chin with the same small cleft that Clara remembered so well. But more than that, the baby had Clara's own mouth, her own stubborn jawline, her own way of holding her head, even in those first moments of life. This child looked exactly like the baby Clara had given birth to 20 years ago. The baby she had given away. The baby she had never been allowed to keep. Mary reached for the child with shaking arms, and Clara placed the baby against her chest. Mother and daughter, both crying now, both perfect and alive and real. Clara stepped back, her own hands trembling for the first time in years. "She's beautiful," Mary whispered. "She's perfect." Clara cleaned up in silence, moving through the familiar motions while her mind spun like a wheel stuck in mud. Thomas Hayes. Her Thomas. The man who had loved her and left her and sworn he would come back. The father of the child she had carried and lost and mourned for 20 years. He had come back. Just not to her. As dawn touched the edges of the cabin windows, Clara packed her bag and prepared to leave. Mary slept with the baby in her arms, both of them breathing slow and steady. The hardest part was over. The new life had begun. Clara stood in the doorway, looking back at the mother and child on the bed. This baby girl would grow up knowing her mother's love. She would have what Clara's first daughter never could. What Clara herself had been denied. The morning air was cool against her face as she stepped outside. Her horse waited patiently, ready for another journey to another town. But for the first time in 20 years, Clara Hayes wasn't sure she could keep running from the truth that had finally caught up with her. Clara sat in her wagon as the sun climbed higher, but she couldn't make her hands pick up the reins. The baby's cry still echoed in her ears, mixing with another cry from long ago. Her first baby, her lost daughter. The child she had held for exactly 3 minutes before her father took her away. 20 years melted like snow in spring, and Clara was 19 again, standing in her father's house with her belly round and her heart breaking. The year was 1855, and she lived in a white house outside Austin, Texas, where her father preached every Sunday about sin and salvation, where she had learned to be quiet, to be good, to never ask for more than what was given. But Thomas Hayes had made her want more. She closed her eyes and let the memory take her back. Thomas had been 22 then, tall and lean with hands that knew how to be gentle. He worked cattle for the big ranches, driving herds north to Kansas, and he had the kind of smile that made her forget everything her father had taught her about proper young ladies. They met at the general store on a Tuesday morning in March. Clara was buying flour for her mother's bread when Thomas walked in, his boots dusty from the trail, his hat in his hands. He asked the storekeeper for tobacco, but his eyes never left Clara's face. "Morning, miss," he had said, and his voice was like warm honey. Clara had looked down at her hands, the way she had been taught, but she felt her cheeks burn red. "Good morning," she whispered. "I'm Thomas Hayes," he said, stepping closer. "Just got back from driving cattle to Abilene. Haven't seen you around before." "I don't get to town much," Clara replied, still not looking up. "My father keeps me busy at home." "Your father wouldn't be Reverend Williams, would he?" Thomas asked, and Clara heard something change in his voice. She nodded, and Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Everyone knew Reverend Williams. Everyone knew his rules about proper behavior and the wages of sin. Everyone knew his daughter was supposed to be above such things as talking to cowboys in the general store. But Thomas didn't leave. Instead, he bought his tobacco and walked Clara to her wagon, carrying her bag of flour like it weighed nothing at all. He helped her up to the seat and tipped his hat. "Maybe I'll see you again, Miss Williams," he said. "Maybe," Clara had whispered, and drove home with her heart beating like a drum. She saw him again 3 days later, and again the following week. He would find reasons to be in town when she came for supplies. They would talk by her wagon, always proper, always careful. He told her about the trails he rode, the cattle he drove, the big sky country he had seen. She told him about the books she read, the songs she sang when no one was listening, the dreams she kept locked up in her heart. By summer, she was in love. By fall, she was meeting him in secret, walking with him by the creek that ran behind her father's land. He kissed her there under the cottonwood trees, and she knew she would follow him anywhere. "I'm going to make something of myself," Thomas told her one evening as they sat by the water. "I'm going to save money and buy land and build a house. A real house, not a cabin, with windows and a porch and room for children to run." "That sounds wonderful," Clara said, her head on his shoulder. "I want to build it for you," Thomas said, and turned her face toward his. "I want you to be my wife, Clara. I want to give you everything." She said yes before she could think, before she could remember all the reasons why it was impossible, before she could hear her father's voice telling her about the kind of men who worked cattle and drank whiskey and lived without God. They were married in secret 2 weeks later, by a justice of the peace in the next county. Clara wore her Sunday dress, and Thomas wore his cleanest shirt, and they promised to love each other until death parted them. Then Thomas gave her a thin gold ring and kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I have to go north again," he told her that night. "One more drive, maybe 2, enough to get us started right. I'll be back by Christmas, and we'll tell your father then. We'll be married proper in his church, and he can't do anything about it." Clara believed him. She went home that night and hid the ring on a chain around her neck, under her dress where no one could see. She counted the days until Christmas and dreamed about the house with windows and children running in the yard. But Christmas came and went, and Thomas didn't return. Clara waited and watched the road until her father began to ask questions. She made excuses, said she was feeling poorly, spent more and more time in her room. By February, she couldn't hide the truth anymore. Her father found out on a cold morning when Clara couldn't keep her breakfast down. He stood in her doorway like the wrath of God, his face terrible with understanding. "You sinful girl," he said, and his voice was quiet and hard. "You foolish, shameful girl." Clara tried to tell him about the marriage, about the ring around her neck, about Thomas's promises. But her father wouldn't listen. He called her a whore and a liar, said no decent man would marry his daughter in secret, said the child she carried was a bastard, conceived in sin and shame. He locked her in her room for 3 months, told the congregation she was sick, brought her meals, and lectured her about redemption through suffering. Clara wrote letters to Thomas, begging him to come back, to tell her father the truth. But the letters came back unopened. No one knew where Thomas Hayes had gone. The baby came in late summer, a daughter with Thomas's eyes and Clara's stubborn chin. Clara held her for 3 minutes, long enough to memorize her perfect face, long enough to whisper, "I love you," into her tiny ear. Then her father took the child away. "She'll be raised by good Christian people," he said. "People who will give her a proper name and a proper life. You'll never see her again." Clara never learned where her daughter went. Her father made her promise never to ask, never to look, never to speak of the child to anyone. He sent her away to live with his sister in Oklahoma, told everyone she had died of fever. Clara Williams was buried that year, and Clara Hayes was born in her place. She learned to deliver babies from an old woman in Oklahoma who taught her that bringing life into the world was sacred work. She learned to be useful, to be needed, to move from town to town, helping other women through the pain she understood too well. For 20 years, she had wondered about her daughter. Was she happy? Did she know she was loved? Did she ever look at the sky and feel like someone was missing? Clara had searched for her in every baby she delivered, looking for Thomas's eyes and her own stubborn chin. Now she knew. Her daughter had grown up and fallen in love with the same man who had left them both. The circle had closed in the cruelest way possible. Clara opened her eyes and looked back at the cabin where Mary Sullivan slept with her newborn daughter. This baby was Clara's granddaughter, carried by the girl who had loved Thomas Hayes just as completely, just as foolishly, as Clara had 20 years before. The baby had looked exactly like Clara's lost daughter because she was her lost daughter's child. Thomas had kept his promise to love and leave, just as he always had, just as he always would. The reins felt heavy in Clara's hands as she finally urged her horse forward. But instead of heading to the next town, she turned the wagon around and drove back toward the cabin where her past waited for her to claim it. Clara found Mary 3 days later, burning with fever and barely conscious. The girl lay in her bed with the baby crying beside her, both of them helpless and alone. Clara didn't knock this time. She walked straight in and set her bag on the table like she belonged there. "Mary," she said, placing her hand on the girl's forehead. The fever was bad, the kind that came when birth didn't go clean. Clara had seen it too many times, knew what it meant when a mother's body couldn't fight it. Mary opened her eyes, but they didn't focus properly. "The baby," she whispered. "Is she all right?" Clara picked up the infant, who had been crying so long her voice was nearly gone. The baby was hungry and wet and frightened, but she was alive. Clara changed her clothes and gave her sugar water from her finger until the crying stopped. "She's fine," Clara said, sitting on the edge of the bed with the baby in her arms. "But you're very sick, child. When did the fever start?" "Yesterday morning," Mary said, trying to sit up but falling back against the pillow. I can't feed her. I can't take care of her." Clara knew what she should do. She should find the nearest neighbor, ask them to send for the doctor, make arrangements for the baby's care. But the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and the doctor was in Dodge City, and Mary Sullivan didn't have 10 miles or time for arrangements. So Clara stayed. She made Mary drink water mixed with willow bark tea. She bathed the girl's face with cool cloth and spooned broth between her lips. She fed the baby goats milk from a bottle she made from a leather glove with a small hole poked in the. She did what she had always done. She fought death with her steady hands and her stubborn heart. But some battles couldn't be won. On the second night, Mary woke up clear-eyed for the first time in days. Clara was sitting by the bed, rocking the baby, humming a song her own mother had sung long ago. "You stayed," Mary said, her voice so soft Clara had to lean forward to hear. "Where else would I go?" Clara replied. Mary was quiet for a long time, watching Clara hold her daughter. The baby had settled into the older woman's arms like she belonged there, her tiny hand wrapped around Clara's finger. "She likes you," Mary said. "Babies know things, don't they? They know who they can trust." Clara felt her throat tighten. "She's a good baby. Strong, like her mother." "I'm going to die," Mary said, and it wasn't a question. Clara started to speak, to offer comfort or hope, but Mary shook her head. "I can feel it leaving me," the girl said, "like water running out of a cracked bucket. I'm not afraid. I need to tell someone. About Thomas. About what happened." Clara's hands stilled on the baby's back. "You don't have to. I loved him so much," Mary continued, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "From the first day I saw him in town. He was buying supplies for a cattle drive, and he smiled at me like I was something special, like I mattered." The words fell into the quiet cabin like stones into still water. Clara held the baby tighter and listened to the story she already knew too well. "He said he'd marry me when he got back from Kansas. Said he'd build us a house, and we'd have children and be happy." I believed him. Mary's voice cracked. I believed every word. "Men say things," Clara whispered. "Sometimes they even mean them." "He meant it when he said it," Mary said. "I know he did, but something happened. Something changed his mind. Maybe he met someone else. Maybe he remembered I was just a girl from nowhere with nothing to offer." Clara felt the truth rising in her chest like floodwater, but she pushed it down. This wasn't her story to tell. "Not yet. He wrote me one letter," Mary continued. "Just one after he got to Kansas. Said he missed me. Said he was saving money for our future. Then nothing. 8 months of nothing." Mary turned her head to look at Clara, and in the lamplight her face looked even younger, even more lost. I went to town last month, asked around. Finally found someone who knew him. A man who'd worked cattle with Thomas before. Mary's breath came short now, each word an effort. He told me Thomas Hayes was already married. Had been for years. Said he had a wife somewhere back east, and children too. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked down at the baby in her arms, this innocent child born from the same lie that had broken Clara's own heart 20 years ago. The man said Thomas was known for it, Mary whispered, for making promises he couldn't keep, for leaving women behind when the drive ended. Clara couldn't speak. 20 years of believing Thomas had loved her, had wanted to come back, had been stopped by something beyond his control. 20 years of carrying the hope that somewhere out there was a man who remembered their secret marriage and regretted leaving her behind. But Thomas Hayes had never been coming back. Not to her, not to Mary, not to anyone. He was a man who collected hearts like some men collected coins, and he spent them just as easily. I named her Sarah, Mary said, reaching out to touch the baby's head. After my grandmother. She was the only person who ever really loved me. Clara felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't remember, starting to cry. Sarah's a beautiful name. Will you? Mary's voice was getting weaker now, fading like smoke. Will you make sure she's all right? When I'm gone. Will you find her good people? Clara looked down at the baby, at Sarah, and saw her own lost daughter's face looking back. Saw Thomas's eyes and her own stubborn mouth and something new, something that belonged only to this child. Sarah was not Clara's daughter, but she was her granddaughter. Her blood. Her family. I'll take care of her, Clara said. I promise. Mary smiled then, the first real smile Clara had seen from her. I hoped you would. You have kind hands. Strong hands. She'll need that. The girl closed her eyes and was quiet for so long Clara thought she had fallen asleep. But then Mary spoke once more, so softly Clara had to lean down to hear. Thomas Hayes, she whispered. That was his name. Thomas Hayes. In case it matters someday. Clara felt her heart break open like an egg, spilling 20 years of secrets onto the cabin. She looked at this dying girl who had loved the same man, made the same mistakes, paid the same price. Mary didn't know they were connected by more than just a name. She didn't know about Clara's lost daughter, or her secret marriage, or the child she had given up. But maybe she didn't need to know. Maybe some truths were too heavy for a dying girl to carry. It matters, Clara whispered back. It all matters. Mary Sullivan died just before dawn, while Clara held her hand and the baby slept between them. Her last breath was soft as a sigh, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the child and the woman who had delivered her into this complicated world. Clara sat with them both as the sun rose, thinking about the strange ways that love and loss wound themselves together. Mary had died believing Thomas was married to someone else, never knowing that his wife had been the midwife who caught her daughter, never knowing that her baby's grandmother had been there all along. Perhaps it was better that way. Some stories were too tangled to unravel, too painful to understand. What mattered now was the future, not the past. What mattered was Sarah, sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms, unaware that her world had just changed forever. Clara looked around the small cabin that had become a tomb and a birthplace all at once. She could bury Mary properly, find a place for her in the churchyard in Dodge City. She could take Sarah to the orphanage there, explain about the dead mother and unknown father. Or she could do what her heart was telling her to do. She could take this child who looked exactly like her own lost daughter and give her the life Clara had always dreamed of giving. She could stop running from town to town and make a home somewhere. She could be the grandmother Sarah would need, the family she would never have otherwise. For the first time in 20 years, Clara Hayes was ready to stop moving and start living. Clara buried Mary Sullivan on a hill overlooking the prairie, where the wind would always sing through the grass above her grave. She carved a simple wooden cross and spoke words over the fresh earth about love and loss and the way some people touch our lives so briefly, but change us forever. Sarah slept through the service, wrapped in a quilt Clara had found in Mary's trunk. The baby didn't know her mother was gone, didn't understand that the world had shifted around her while she drew. All she knew was the warmth of Clara's arms and the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that promised safety. Afterward, Clara sat in her wagon, looking down at the cabin where Mary had lived and died. She had packed everything valuable, the few clothes, some dishes, a Bible with Mary's name written inside the cover in careful script. Things Sarah might want someday, when she was old enough to ask questions about the mother she would never remember. The horse stamped and shook his head, eager to be moving again. He was used to the rhythm of travel, the constant search for the next town, the next birth, the next beginning. But Clara made no move to pick up the reins. Instead, she thought about the house Thomas had promised her 20 years ago. The one with windows and a porch and room for children to run. He had never built that house, had probably never meant to. But Clara could build it now, for herself and for Sarah. She could make the dream real, even if the dreamer had proven false. "What do you think, little one?" she asked the baby. "Should we find ourselves a place to stay?" Sarah opened her eyes at the sound of Clara's voice. They were still Thomas's eyes, blue as morning sky, but they looked at Clara with complete trust. This child would never know that her grandfather had been a man who broke promises. She would grow up knowing only that she was wanted, loved, chosen. Clara had money saved. 20 years of traveling from town to town, of accepting payment in coins and goods, of living simply and spending little. She could buy land somewhere, build a small house, maybe start a garden. She could still work as a midwife for the women nearby, but she wouldn't have to wander anymore. She could have roots. The idea frightened her almost as much as it thrilled her. For so long, movement had been safety. As long as she kept traveling, she couldn't get too attached to any one place or person. She couldn't be hurt again the way Thomas had hurt her. But now she had Sarah to think about. A child needed more than a wagon and a horse. She needed a home. Clara remembered the town of Cedar Falls, about 50 miles north. She had delivered babies there twice over the years, knew it to be a good place with decent. There was a widow there, Mrs. Patterson, who had offered to sell Clara her small house on the edge of town. At the time, Clara had smiled and declined, explaining that she couldn't settle down. But Mrs. Patterson had said the offer would stand if Clara ever changed her mind. Maybe it was time to take her up on it. Clara picked up the reins at last and turned the wagon north, toward Cedar Falls and the future she was finally brave enough to claim. Sarah slept against her chest, safe in a makeshift sling Clara had fashioned from one of Mary's shawls. The baby's breathing was soft and steady, a counterpoint to the rolling of the wagon wheels. As they traveled, Clara found herself talking to Sarah the way she had never been able to talk to another living soul. She told her about the towns they passed, the people they might meet, the life they could build together. She told her about her real grandmother, the one who had died when Clara was young, who had taught her to sew and cook and find joy in simple things. She told her about books and songs and the way sunsets looked different in every place but were beautiful everywhere. She didn't tell her about Thomas. That story could wait until Sarah was older, if it needed to be told at all. Some truths were burdens too heavy for young shoulders to carry. They reached Cedar Falls as the sun was setting on their second day of travel. The town looked exactly as Clara remembered, a main street lined with shops and houses, a church with a white steeple, children playing in yards while their mothers called them in for supper. It looked like the kind of place where a baby could grow up safe and Mrs. Patterson was delighted to see Clara again, and even more delighted when she learned about the baby and Clara's intention to settle down. "I always hoped you'd come back," the older woman said, holding Sarah while Clara looked through the little house. "This town needs a good midwife, and that baby needs a good home. Seems like it all works out." The house was small but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a good stove, and windows that faced east toward the morning sun. There was a small garden plot behind it, and room for a chicken coop if Clara wanted fresh eggs. The price was fair, and Mrs. Patterson was willing to accept payment over time. "I've got nowhere else to go and no one else to leave it to," the widow explained. "Better to sell it to someone who will make it a real home again." Clara paid what she could that day and promised the rest by Christmas. Mrs. Patterson helped her move in, brought over a cradle she had been saving in her attic, and spread word through town that Clara Hayes was back to stay. By the end of the week, Clara had her first call, a young wife expecting her first child in the spring. By the end of the month, she had 3 more women on her list. Word spread the way it always did in small towns. Clara Hayes was a good midwife with gentle hands and a kind heart. She could be trusted with the most precious moments of a family's life. Sarah thrived in the little house. She slept in the cradle by Clara's bed, learned to smile at the sound of Clara's voice, grew plump and happy on goat's milk and mashed vegetables. Clara marveled at how quickly she adapted to this new life, how natural it felt to plan meals and tend a garden and rock a baby to sleep every night. She had been afraid that settling down would feel like giving up, like admitting defeat. Instead, it felt like coming home to herself after 20 years of wandering in the wilderness. She had been running from her pain for so long. She had forgotten that healing was possible. The first baby Clara delivered in Cedar Falls was born on a snowy night in December. She walked to the house through ankle-deep snow, carrying her bag and a lantern, leaving Sarah with Mrs. Patterson for the evening. It felt strange to go to a birth without traveling for days to get there, strange but wonderful. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, born to parents who wept with joy when Clara placed him in their arms. As she cleaned up afterward, the new father pressed coins into her hand and thanked her for bringing their son safely into the world. "We're lucky to have you here in town," he said. "Our children will be blessed to have someone like you watching over." Clara walked home through the snow, thinking about blessings and luck and the way life could surprise you when you least expected it. She had spent 20 years helping other people's children come into the world while mourning the daughter she had lost. Now she had Sarah, who looked like that lost daughter, but was entirely her own person, entirely a gift Clara had never thought to hope. At home, she found Mrs. Patterson asleep in the rocking chair with Sarah in her arms. Both of them looked peaceful, content, like they belonged exactly where they were. Clara covered them with a quilt and made tea, watching the snow fall past her kitchen window. Tomorrow, she would start planning Sarah's first Christmas. She would buy fabric to make her a dress, wood to carve her a toy, ingredients to bake cookies that would make the whole house smell like home. She would begin the traditions that would shape Sarah's childhood, the memories that would last long after Clara was gone. For the first time since she was 19 years old, Clara Hayes felt like she had a future worth planning. She had delivered her last baby as a wandering midwife. From now on, she would deliver babies as someone who belonged somewhere, someone who had roots and reasons to stay. Sarah stirred in Mrs. Patterson's arms and made the soft sounds that meant she was waking up. Clara lifted her gently, holding her close, breathing in the sweet scent of baby skin and new possibilities. "Welcome home, little one," she whispered. "We're going to be just fine." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the road that led away from Cedar Falls. By morning, Clara's wagon tracks would be erased, as if she had never been a woman who ran from town to town delivering other people's babies. As if she had always been exactly what she was now, a grandmother with steady hands, a full heart, and finally, a place to call home.